Let's talk Gauss weapons, living metal and reanimation, with a look through Codex Necrons and a guide to fielding every single unit. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're back for a rather beefy Necron video. I thought it would be quite nice to go through the Codex again, seeing as basically between the balanced data slate points drops, a whole load of things getting core and command protocols changing, the army is looking very different to how it was a few months back. In this video we're going to go through each and every single unit in the Necron Codex and talk about how I think about fielding them in a typical game of 40k. The aim is to be at least fairly practical, how many copies of the squads that you might want to take and the kind of numbers you might field with them, some thoughts on the Wargear choices, supporting any budgeted stratagems, and roughly what they might aim to do in game. In general for this one, I'll usually be talking about getting the best out of each unit, rather than talking about which ones to pick and which ones to leave at home, though we might touch on that from time to time. In any case, let's jump into it. We'll go through each section of the Codex, starting with the troops, and then move on through transports, elites, fast attack, and so on. First up, let's start with the core of the Deathless Army then, in the Necron Warriors. A fairly solid troops choice. I'd typically field them anywhere between squad sizes of 10 to 20, probably usually going either for 10 with minimal support, or for 20 with quite a lot of support. I think within an army you can afford to go fairly heavy if you want to, maybe anywhere between 20 and 60 warriors if you did want to build around them. And you could think about big squads foot-slogging it up the board with multiple characters backing them up, or perhaps smaller squads jumping out of Ghost Arcs, which now got a fair bit cheaper. For their Wargear choices, I do much prefer the Gauss Reaper over the Gauss Flare. Maybe the Flare has a bit more of a niche in Mephrit, or perhaps for backfield objective campers, though you might think about using Immortals for that. Despite the short range, the fact that it hits so much harder I think is generally worth the trade. In terms of support, if you are going for big 20 warrior blocks, then you really can go quite heavy. Overlords for my Will Be Done, maybe even backed up with a Lord for rerolling ones as well, Technomancers for resurrecting them, Chronomancers for a 5+ invul, maybe a Royal Warden to ensure their shooting is not going to get ruined, and there's plenty of good relics and Cryptic Arcana that you can also use to support them, the Resurrection Orb to replenish quite a lot of warriors with their reroll ones to reanimate, the Hypermaterial Ablator for light cover, and the Veil of Darkness is a bit of a classic one, porting a unit of Gauss Reaper warriors around the board and getting them in a threatening position and in range. I think typically if you were using all of these characters though, you'd be wanting to use them on multiple different warrior squads, not just one. Otherwise you'd be over-investing a bit. For stratagems, there's a couple of small command point shooting buffs that can be useful on very big squads of Gauss Reapers, and in general my plan with the warriors would be to march them up the board, hold midfield objectives, maybe use Veil to jump over and fry enemy infantry, and maybe even do a follow-up charge after that to get them all over an objective. When they get shot, they're quite a good target for gamey reanimations to stretch onto objectives or move block. Next up we have the Immortals, tougher and more dangerous Necron warriors that you can field in smaller squads. Typically I think if I was using them I'd be more tempted to field them in small units for 80 points, and do a bit more troop grunt work, such as holding down backfield objectives, providing a bit of ranged fire support, or doing actions and things. After the Gauss Reapers and the Tesla, I probably slightly prefer the Tesla, but I don't think there's much in it. I feel in general they're better off being a slightly longer range threat, and the Tesla can be effective out to the 24 inches. In theory you could build around big squads of 10 of them with similar buffs to the Warriors, but in general I think it goes a bit further on the Warriors than the Immortals. If you're just using 5-man squads, I'd typically keep the buffs pretty minimal. In game I'd usually try and deploy them on home field objectives, maybe in light cover for their fairly decent armor saves, and be a good choice for just pumping out a small amount of damage at range, maybe while doing actions like retrieving data. Next up we've got the Ghost Arc, one of the two transports besides the Night Side, and down a fair few points on its previous incarnation. I perhaps feel that as a transport it's maybe not efficient enough to spam entire phalanxes of them with warriors inside, but maybe more 1 or 2 as a luxury choice to get warriors where they need to be, and jump out and host people with Gauss Reapers. Then when they jump out it can also lend in its own firepower, it does pack a whole load of Gauss Flayers itself. You can heal the nearby Necron warriors, and it could pick up opportunistic buffs from things like Technomancers, or maybe even Necron Overlords if it made sense. I'd probably not plan around supporting it, but if the buffs happen to be there then all well and good. For stratagems, I think one command point for Quantum Deflection is really quite a nice durability one on basically any of the Quantum Shielding units, and Auto Explodes for 1 CP could be nice if there's enemies crawling all over it. In game I'd be wanting to zoom the warriors into the midfield, have them jump out and hit people with Gauss Reapers, and from there do a bit of drive-by flaying and maybe do some nuisance charges to hold up enemy units who aren't going to be able to deal with it in combat. Into the elite section next, and we'll start out with the Lich Guard, down to 25 points per model now, and I think they're a unit that can be fairly flexible, anywhere in squad sizes from 5 to 10. With combat units, I think there's usually a bit more incentive to build out to bigger squads, as it can make them a tricky prospect to charge, as if an enemy unit can't deal meaningful damage to them, they might just get killed in return. I'd use smaller units for countercharging and maybe being durable threats on objectives, and again bigger units that could take decent buffs, things like My Will Be Done, resurrections from Technomancers, or potentially even a resurrection orb. Out of the choices, I'd typically take the shields for good durability with the 2+ save and 4+ invul, though I don't think that the Warscythe loadout is out and out bad. It does make them a lot more threatening with damage too. As they can be a big meaty unit, I think they could be fairly worth of extra support or stratagems. One command point for disruption fields for +1 strength can be relevant against a lot of targets, and +1 command points for an attack as well could also soup them up. In general, I'd want them to hide out of line of sight to start with, maybe move up the board, ideally keeping to light cover with their good saves, and push up to fight for midfield objectives with the enemy's own heavy hitters. Next up we have the Sinister Flayed ones, now just 10 points a model, and basically very efficient combat flavoured warriors. I think that you can use Flayed ones in two different ways. Small squads of 5 and 6 for dropping in, maybe doing actions and potentially nuisance charging, or going all in on buffing them, getting anywhere up to 20 of them for durable melee warriors. For 200 points they can be really tough and annoying to shift in a dynasty that has OBSEC, or if they're in Novok then they can be a truly dangerous threat, getting an AP-1 plus Protocol of the Hungry Void and other goodies. If they're just dropping in to be disruption units and retrieve data, they don't really need any support. Otherwise, again, you could go very big just like the warriors. Chronomancers I think are particularly nice for the 5+ invul and reroll charges, but other standard things like Overlords, Lords, and maybe a Hypermaterial Ablator for cover are all good too. The disruption squads just want to drop in, retrieve data, and then skirmish with enemy units, and the big durable blob would likely want to start on the board, I think, park a whole load of cheap and durable Necron bodies on midfield objectives, and threaten the enemy with an obscene number of combat attacks if they get too close. Next up we have the Death Marks, the Necron Snipers. They've dropped in points down to 15 points per model, which is quite nice as they were pretty inefficient before. I still don't think they're at the point that people would really want to be spamming them or anything though. I'd say perhaps a small squad or two as their damage output is fairly low and they're only going to be all that efficient against characters normally. They don't have any Wargear choices. You could potentially attempt to intercept enemy reserves coming in if the opponent is almost certainly going to be reserving things, and if they had a very fragile squad that is actually going to care about their damage 1 shooting. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be supporting them with all that much, probably just camping out on backfield objectives, sniping characters opportunistically, and maybe being basically a different flavour of Immortals with no OBSEC but longer range guns. Next up we've got the Scorpet Destroyers, one of the melee stars of the Codex. Units of 5 of these are a pretty good all-round melee threat, reasonably durable with their toughness and saves, and a very nice stratagem in Whirling Onslaught for -1 to wounds, which maybe makes a single unit of these a little bit more high value than multiple units. I might be a bit more tempted to run units of 5 of them than 6, just to avoid blast or coherency issues, though you could always have the extra one if you wanted. And if you were building out to 5 models, the Plasma Sight is probably just about worth it, though I don't think it's really mandatory. In terms of other support, I think they're certainly dangerous enough to justify some buffs. My Will Be Done, Chronomancers for 5+ invul and reroll charges, Technomancers for resurrecting models closer to the enemy to make their charge distance shorter, and when they get to combat they could make good use of disruption fields as well. Ideally, I think they'd want to be deploying out of line of sight, move up behind cover or through light cover if you can, and aim to charge and destroy high value enemy elite infantry with their great multi-damage and high AP attacks. Next up we've got Canoptic Spiders, again a unit that you could probably field in 2 different ways, maybe just the one for supporting units of Scarabs if you were taking those, although you could build up to a big unit of 3 as they do have some fair melee threat and a whole bunch of volume fire if you take Particle Casters. I think if you are taking these I would be tempted to pick up at least 1 Gloom Prism for them. Having a Deny or 2 floating around in the army will help out a fair bit against psychic foes. I think it is probably worth the 5 points. I think the Particle Beamers are very good firepower for 10 points, 12 shots at Strength 5, AP 0 and Damage 1, but I think they do divide the priorities a little bit, and AP 0 attacks are going to be far better against certain targets than others. The Fabricator Claw is okay, but only if there's vehicles nearby, I guess. I sort of feel like you're rarely going to want to take all of these upgrades on one model. That'll be getting you all the way up to 80 points. If you're taking a single one, it's more there to support the Scarabs than really be a big threat in itself, though it can always lend a hand after its support role is done. If you're going for a bit more of a big damage combo, with say a unit of 3 of them or more, something like a Technomancer with a control node and perhaps a failsafe overcharger could make them into a genuinely quite dangerous threat. You could be putting out really quite a lot of volume fire at strength 5, plus they'd all have a few more attacks in combat. Now they've recently gained core, you can also resurrect them with a Technomancer, give them things like My Will Be Done, or 1 command point for disruption fields as well. Again, that might tip the balance in combat. If you're just using one to support Scarabs, I'd try and heal it out of line of sight. Maybe heal the Scarabs in the general direction of the enemy to make their charges shorter, and then once it's no longer as useful for that role, you can either just throw it onto objectives for more bodies there, or maybe use its melee profile. For a big unit, I think they generally want to be fairly central in the board, seeing as they're pretty slow. Push up towards the objectives that your opponent's likely to be fighting over, put out some decent volume fire, and maybe follow up with a charge if it presents itself. If the Technomancer ever gets a chance to heal one of these for resurrecting 60 points, then that's a massive win right there. Next up, we've got the Cryptothralls. You get 2 of them for 40 points, and don't get any Wargear choices outside of their claws and I-beam. I'd see them as a bit of an optional choice for Cryptex. They'll be able to put out a bit of melee attacks when they are next to them, and the combat isn't really all that bad for the points. I don't think they're really worth supporting in their own right, and they're more a support to the Cryptex themselves. Though they are quite a small and flexible unit, could be quite nice just for holding down objectives for super cheap, or doing things like screening or nuisance charges, or any actions that 2 model units are allowed to do. Not too bad for 40 points. Depending on slots available though, if you did want a very cheap unit of infantry, then you might think about things like Flayed Ones or Locust Heavy Destroyers, both of which you can run for 50 points and have a fair bit more threat. Next up, we've got the Canoptic Reanimator. I'd probably only say up to 1 of these in an army. I think having more than 1 would be putting too much points into them. They don't get any Wargear choices, just some quite weak range and melee attacks, and they basically exist to buff things like big units of warriors and flayed ones pushing up the board. Their defensive profile is really quite weak, so they want to ideally hide out of line of sight wherever possible, and have the warriors or flayed ones chain back to them so they can get line of sight for the reanimation beams, and this can allow them to get a 4+ reanimation, which is actually a genuinely powerful defensive buff to the unit. Theoretically, you could reassign the reanimation beam halfway through the enemy's shooting phase or something, but I think realistically that's rarely going to be useful. If and when it's done with reanimating warriors, it can just be another expendable unit with a little bit of a threat, if not that much, push it on objectives or nuisance charge the enemy, maybe kill an infantry model or 2. Hopefully between the warriors it reanimates, plus its own small threat, it might have done enough to justify its existence. Next up, we've got the Triarch Stalker. Again, it's probably a model that I'd not take more than 1 of in an army, as I think you get into diminishing returns, plus I'd only really want to take it on a Necron army that's rather focused on shooting. Mefrit springs to mind. Out of its 3 gun weapons, I would be tempted most by the Heavy Gauss Cannon. 6 shots at strength 7, AP3 and damage D3 is quite a good generalist profile, and it has a longer range than the other guns, which means that you can put its rerolls on a unit a bit further away. Once you've shot a unit, the rest of your army gets reroll ones to hit against it at range, so it's quite nice if you're just trying to focus down a big threatening enemy unit in the midfield. If it's shot, quantum deflection isn't too bad, but to be honest I wouldn't generally bother with too much support for it, as its damage output isn't great unless you just have characters hanging around doing nothing. I generally want it to loiter somewhere in the backfield, somewhere just outside 24-inch range maybe, marking targets for other bigger shooting threats, and potentially could charge in to squash an enemy model or 2 if they do get too close, and it's nothing too threatening. I must admit I don't think it's one of the stronger Necron choices. Moving on, we've got the Hexmark Destroyer, the chap with the 6 pistols for clearing through hordes, and I feel like it's the sort of unit that if it was good enough to stand on its own 3 legs as a damage dealer, it'd probably be worth taking in multiples, but I'm not sure it's quite at that point. He doesn't get any Wargear choices, though it could be an interesting choice for bearing relics or warlord traits. If you wanted a little bit of extra damage, you could give him the Gauntlet of the Conflagrator. That's a potential one to double down on his anti-horde roll. Typically for this guy, I would want to keep him in Deep Strike Reserve, and then drop him down and pile extra damage onto an exposed enemy unit. I think he's only going to be all that efficient against hordes or really quite weak exposed support characters. AP -1 and damage 1 shooting just isn't that outstanding. And ideally he'd want to be kept screened behind your own units or somewhere where he's going to drop and then not get immediately deleted back, as I think he's typically going to need multiple rounds of shooting to make him really worth it. If the enemy does happen to be using some rather weak reserves coming in, then I think Etheric Interception is actually a bit of a better choice for him than the Death Marks. A lot of armies won't really care about his intercepting type damage output, but for a few armies it could be pretty scary, things like Genestealer Cults or Craftworld Eldar Aspect Warriors perhaps. Previously I would have said that he was a reasonable choice for getting command protocols on units, but that's no longer locked by character auras. Lastly for the elites we come to the Catan. There's 4 different flavours of these in the elite slot: the Nightbringer, Void Dragon, Transcendent and Deceiver. You can only take 1 per detachment, and particularly in Nephilim it's not all that incentivised to spam detachments. Kind of a shame for Necron players, as at least a few people like to run multiple, and they can be annoying to deal with in numbers due to their Necrodermis and only taking 3 wounds. I suspect for the most part detachment spam probably isn't going to be worth it to unlock more Catan. Out of the 4 options, I feel like the Deceiver is probably behind the others. The Nightbringer, Void Dragon and Transcendent Catan I think all have decent arguments to make for them. The Nightbringer is just a pretty much no questions asked answer to most enemy characters hiding behind arcane defences like Invuls, Feel No Pains or Take Maximum Wounds mechanics. The Void Dragon is maybe a bit more of a general all-rounder with a bit more melee threat. He's also got a better armor save and some nasty tricks against vehicles. And the Transcendent Catan isn't quite as strong as either of them, though is a fair bit cheaper and therefore more durable for the cost. I'd say for the points the Deceiver probably is the worst of the 3. I'd say perhaps the main draw to him, besides his main profile, is the ability to redeploy a bunch of Necron units at the start of the game, though I'm not sure it's quite enough to make up the points difference that you pay over the Transcendent. They don't get Wargear, though they do get to choose their powers. For general purpose damage dealing long range ones, Antimatter Meteor, Sky of Falling Stars and Transdimensional Thunderbolt are all really nice. I guess Sky of Falling Stars can be a bit niche depending on exactly what forces you're fighting. Potentially, if they close in with the enemy and they have lots of multiple small units around, you could use Strange Echoes to swap out a power for Cosmic Fire. That one would be okay if you've got absolutely tons of units and you could deal out D3 mortal wounds to several. Otherwise, they don't really do much in terms of interacting with the rest of the Necron army. But for other stratagem support, Entropic Strike is really nice on something like the Void Dragon. Ignoring invuls in combat potentially can mean that he can punch up against characters similar to the Nightbringer, if you are willing to spend a few CP. And dimensional destabilization could occasionally be a good idea if you did need to pay command points to get something to kill, say, one last enemy infantry model that you didn't have an answer to. In general, for the amount of points that they cost, I think Catan needs to be played with quite carefully in-game. When they're on quite a lot of wounds, they can usually guarantee that they're pretty much invincible for a turn or 2. So if you can ever prevent them taking a phase worth of damage, that's really quite a powerful thing. In general, the thing that you really don't want to happen is for them to take multiple turns of damage in a row. Ideally, you don't want to have one exposed to a turn when the opponent can smite, shoot, and then charge it, as you might just have a theoretically very durable model reduced to dust in just one turn. For that reason, I typically want to jump them from cover to cover, maybe peeking out and blasting one unit with mortal wounds each turn. Jumping on high value things like enemy characters or elite infantry depending on good invul saves, and potentially go out in a blaze of glory when they know that their opponent can't kill them with the 3 wounds that they'll take this turn, so can potentially allow them to deal some great damage while still surviving. I feel they're perhaps a unit that's a bit more high skill in the Necron Codex. If you're playing against a good player, then they're likely to have a harder time, and you might have a better time if they can jump around and survive for most of the game, as opposed to going out early in a blaze of glory. Fast attack next, and we'll start with Scarab Swarms. Some of the best units of the Codex early in the edition. The shine does seem to have come off them a little bit. They're still good for small units of cheap, fast annoyance screening, and they can potentially overload the enemy with big squads with tons of wounds. You do get 4 wounds per base of them, and they're only 15 points. They don't get any choice for Wargear, but big squads I think actually can be fairly well worth supporting. You potentially could have a spider on hand for healing a base each turn. They actually could get on okay with Technomancers as well. Things like the failsafe Overcharger or Canoptic Control Node could actually have them hitting with semi-decent attacks, particularly if you're in Novok, as they get on quite well with the buffs there. Otherwise though, I think they're a unit that gets on pretty well with the Obsec and pre-game move dynasties. Putting a whole load of these annoying things on midfield objectives early could be pretty frustrating for the opponents. Whether you build big on them or keep them cheap, they're likely just going to screen and hold up midfield objectives, maybe do some actions, and could potentially do some nuisance charging, move blocking, or bullying enemy light infantry. I quite like that they've got a couple of situational stratagems as well. Heroic intervention for Canoptech units is pretty handy, and the self-destruct one could give you a few mortal wounds if it helps bring down an important foe. Next up, we have the Wraiths, another fast, tough and irritating Canoptech unit, but ones that can actually be made into fairly decent damage dealers, particularly now they've got core. Several Necron lists do seem to run multiple units of these guys. They are pretty tough, fast and fairly fighty, usually a recipe for success, and again they really like either being Novok for more melee or Obsec and pre-game move dynasty. Again, being fast and tough really helps steal those objectives nice and early. Wargear wise, I'd be most tempted just to keep them cheap with the claws. I don't think the guns are terrible, though aren't really outstanding, and I not want to pass up on the AP or the damage for the whip coils. As you can field them in fairly big threatening units, it can be a unit that's well worth supporting. Maybe again a Technomancer is one of the obvious best choices. Resurrecting Wraiths from the dead and nearest the opponent can shorten charges. The control node can have them hitting better, though you could also get very decent damage buffs from My Will Be Done or the Silent King's reroll wound rolls. In battle, I think they'd usually want to be starting hiding out of line of sight, use their good movement and maybe some advances to get to the midfield objectives, perhaps pick up some support from the characters along the way, charge the enemy units, and then if any survive you can fall back and charge something annoying. Certainly not a bad Necron battle line unit. Next up we've got the Ophidian Destroyers, 30 points per model, and more of a fast, fragile and still fairly dangerous elite infantry killer, perhaps balancing a bit of utility use with raw melee damage. In squads, I think again somewhere between 3 and 5 seems pretty reasonable. I probably wouldn't go crazy on spamming them, maybe just one unit in the army for their utility plus their threat. I'd say for more battle line units you might be better off with things like Scorpec Destroyers or Wraiths, as I think quite a lot of their value is in their movement and deep striking and things. I generally want to use them fairly independently, without characters nearby all that much, perhaps deep strike where they need to be, and hopefully with Novox +1 to charge and a CP reroll they could get where they need to be. They've got a few decent stratagems, disruption fields could be pretty good for them as they've got a slightly lower strength than most, and burrowing nightmares could be handy later in the game. If the squad's still surviving, it could be a way to get them to threaten enemy units that would otherwise be safe, or get them around to do some secondaries. Perhaps a fairly flexible unit that you can vary depending on the matchup, either starting on the board or deep striking, and having their primary goal either being secondaries or hunting down elite infantry if they've got something particularly good that they can get their claws into. Next up we've got the Tomb Blades, which got a rather nice points drop in the points changes. They're now just 20 points base, so fairly cheap and fast ranged threats. Again, they do feel like a bit more of a flexible unit. You could just have units of 3 for cheap fast screening units that bully light infantry well, or justify building out to big blocks of 9 of them, treat them like much faster moving warriors or immortals, and stack a bunch of buffs on them to delete enemy units off the board. For the guns, I feel perhaps the Particle Beamer might be my overall favourite, being 5 points cheaper than the others and spams really quite a lot of fire. Maybe if you are building around making them into a proper damage dealing piece though, then maybe the gas might be preferable for the extra AP. For the various vein type upgrades, I think that both the Shadow Looms and Shield Veins both seem pretty well balanced. For 3 points each, I could easily take or leave either of them. A 3+ save bike with a 5+ invul is certainly going to be a lot harder to shift, but then you are going up from 20 points to 26, and they're nowhere near as efficient in the damage dealing department. I could easily go either way on including one or both of those. Otherwise, for support, I think My Will Be Done on them is a particularly nice one. Give them +1 to hit in the command phase, then they get to fly off and hit whatever they want. Otherwise, a 5+ invul for a Chronomancer could be okay, particularly if they've not taken any of the durability boosts. In general though, with their fast movement, the HQs might well struggle to keep up, so buffs might be a bit more of a first turn thing, and then they go off and do their own thing. Either way, with their good movement, I'd want to be putting them either out of range of the enemy or behind line of sight blocking terrain, and make sure that whenever they engage with the enemy they actually get the first strike and aren't hit first. Triarch Praetorians next, the jump troops of Zarek himself. I think I'd be most tempted to field a single big squad of 10 of these alongside Mr. Zarek's Silent King himself, and out of their 2 weapons I'd go for the Rods of the Covenant with their damage to shooting and melee as opposed to the particle casters and swords. I think it just helps them be a bit more of a general purpose threat rather than just literally bullying infantry. As they don't get to be from a specific dynasty, I think they're usually going to be best if you are using the Silent King himself, as that way you can actually put some really big meaningful buffs on them, and otherwise I think they're probably going to lose out to other choices in comparisons. Stratagems wise though, if you're tangling with toughness 5 or 6 targets, then disruption fields will be very nice, and they could also have a command point for +1 to hit as well, so have 2 decent damage buffs there. In game I'd want to use their decent movement to stay in cover and hidden until they get to strike first, and hopefully jump out, shoot and charge, ideally with the rerolls to wound from the Silent King. Moving along to the heavy support now, and first up we have the Annihilation Barge. Maybe not the most overwhelming firepower that the Necrons can bring to bear. It spams a fair amount of volume shots, maybe a little bit better in Mephrit where they get some AP at close range. Again, I feel like it's a unit that you could easily take multiple of or none. I feel like at their points cost, most of the more optimised Necron lists will probably pass them up, unfortunately. The damage output was okay against 1 wound infantry, though not particularly outstanding against anything else. For the extra 5 points, I would be tempted to take the Gauss cannon over the extra Tesla. Not the biggest deal either way, I think, seeing as the Tesla kind of doubles down on the main purpose, but I feel like the Gauss is a bit stronger. For the most part, being quite a light vehicle unit, it's maybe not the optimal target for buffs and support. Maybe if you have Technomancers with cloaks around to opportunistically heal them, or My Will Be Done without a better target, that could be okay. And again, like most of the vehicles, 1 command point for Quantum Deflection is a pretty decent durability buff if they are going to get focused. Maybe one of the main advantages are that they're quite fast and mobile, so hopefully they can hide out of range or out of line of sight, jump in and get the Alpha Strike, and hopefully get a few decent turns of fire out of them before they go down, and go some way to making their points back. If they can get lines of sight on damage 1 infantry with low saves, that's a pretty optimal target for them. And I guess if it did come to it, then throwing them onto an objective as an expendable unit isn't the worst thing. They are pretty fast and at least fairly cheap. Next up we've got the Canoptek Doomstalker. Again, perhaps unfortunately a unit that I can't see many people taking in optimised lists right now. The model's really cool, but with the Doomsday Arc only 30 points more, it just does a lot more and in a very similar role. And even that has its own issues with having to remain static for full firepower. If you were running them though, you could run 1 or 2 dotted in your deployment zone, or maybe 3 together with a Cryptek with a Canoptek control node for +1 to hit. The shooting for a trio of them would be at least fairly scary, though still maybe not the hardest thing ever to avoid, and still not super overwhelming for over 400 points. Wargear wise, it doesn't have any choices besides its Doomday Blaster with its D6 shots and D6 damage. Certainly can punch high but can whiff quite hard. And again, besides the Canoptek control node for buffing a bunch of these, I feel like they are a bit points light for focusing any other major buffs on them. They do have that fun stratagem, Revenge of the Doomstalker for 2 CP. You can shoot an enemy unit that kills a character. Occasionally that could genuinely be quite powerful, but it is super situational. In game, I think you'd want to be very careful about where you set them up, or where they might plan to move to first turn. They really want to hang out somewhere where they can actually sit with a good line of sight, and not have to use their worst profile, maybe somewhere on a flank or in some dense cover perhaps for a bit of durability. And if you are forced to move, I'd think very carefully about where it's going to be next turn, and trying to make sure that your opponent can't just hide from it again. Advancing might well be worth it depending on what targets present. If I was taking one of the Doomsday weapons, it would be the Doomsday Arc. Again, probably not something that I'd go too crazy on, maybe 1 or 2 of them in the Necron backfield for some slightly more static firepower to complement other more mobile units. Again, it's just that stipulation of not being able to move if you want to have its good gun. That means if the opponent really wants to avoid it, often they can. Again, no options of Wargear, but better than the Doomstalker, it does actually get Ballistic Skill 3 and an entire bank of Gauss Flayers if enemy infantry gets close, and combine that with a better defensive profile, and this thing is just all around stronger, I think. As a slightly more bigger and threatening core unit, My Will Be Done for +1 to hit could be quite nice. The Royal Warden could give you a little insurance against it getting locked up, and some opportunistic healing from a Technomancer with a Canoptek Cloak might not be bad either. Quantum Deflection seems like it might have some of the best use on this, as it's one of the bigger vehicles with quantum shielding, and Curse of the Pharaon could be okay if it happens to be blowing up in the enemy's midst, though I guess that is pretty unlikely. Otherwise, pretty similar stuff to the Doomstalker. Really wants to be put down where it could see multiple good points on the battlefield, particularly things like objective markers, and at least it's got so many Gauss Flayers that it could actually well be worth moving to actually get them in range of a light infantry unit. 20 shots might well be able to hoover them up quite well. Next we have the Locust Destroyers. These are the standard ones with the Gauss cannons, and they're generally reasonably hard-hitting generalist firepower, but not actually all that tough to the enemy counter-strike. I think I'd be most tempted to take them in a fairly big unit with maybe 5 including a heavy destroyer, as then you could actually get some pretty decent value out of that extermination protocol stratagem, 2 command points to reroll the wound roll. For some reason the heavy destroyer costs less here than it does in the standard squad, so for the Gauss Destructor for the massive anti-tank shot, I think that's well worth an upgrade. And if you are building a big unit of these, then My Will Be Done is a pretty excellent choice for them. Between that and the destroyer rerolls, you should be hitting most shots, and otherwise just general core support stuff is nice. Technomancer's healing them returns a lot of points to the board. The Royal Warden could potentially ensure them against getting locked up, or Destroyer Lords could cruise around with them for the first turn or two and give them some more rerolls. Perhaps the Overlords My Will Be Done and Technomancer might be the highest value out of them. As they're at least fairly dangerous but quite fragile, I think they'd want to be hiding from as many things as possible. Staying safe in ruins or something turn 1, hiding well and jumping out, keeping light cover if they can when they do so, and hopefully blast an enemy threat off the board with the extermination protocols, ideally in a place where the opponent isn't just going to delete them in return. Otherwise, there's the Locust Heavy Destroyers, 50 points per model rather than 40, but I think they do have the better damage profile overall. The Gauss Destructor for the anti-tank fire really is quite savage for 50 points. Certainly not bad to have a 3d3 damage shot on a 50-point model. For these, I think they're efficient enough to stand on their own merit. Single model units could just be annoying threats to remove, occasionally blasting out some very solid anti-tank damage, and maybe just being a cheap and fairly expendable unit that you could throw onto objectives in a pinch. Otherwise, though, bigger squads of 3 are well worth supporting. My Will Be Done to hit better, the Technomancer's Resurrections and Destroyer Lords once more. I guess you could use extermination protocols, but only on a unit of 3 of them. I think it's not quite as overwhelming. For the command point investment, I think you're almost just as good with standard command point rerolls there. Dynasties wise, I think they're also pretty interesting in the Zarakan dynasty. If you do have the heavy support slots available, then the single reroll is rarely going to have a better damage output than here. In general, I think I'd want to play them very similar to the standard Locust ones, hide them initially and jump out and hit tanks hard, if possible keeping them safe for counter-attacks, or maybe having a Technomancer in hand to set one back up if they die. Moving on to the Flyers now, and first up we have the Night Scythe for 120 points. They're an interesting option that you could use as a transport instead of the Ghost Arc, though I think overall the Ghost Arc is probably stronger for that role. Even with the -1 to hit on this thing, I think the Ghost Arc is decently tougher, and can actually help out with objectives and things. For Night Scythe, I'd be far more tempted just to use the single one for the Prismatic Dimensional Breach stratagem, put something in strategic reserve, deploy the Night Scythe really far back, and just make it keep very safe for turn 1, use the firepower if you can get range without risking being killed, otherwise just hover back, and then on turn 2, zip towards the enemy, jump out your scary combat threat for 1 command point, and basically get an automatic charge on an important enemy unit and try and kill it dead. It is at least a fairly expensive strategy, having to buy the Night Scythe and 2 command points for the delivery, but not that many armies can essentially get a big scary melee threat out of reserve like this. It is quite a powerful move. Could be very nice on something like Scorpec Destroyers, Lich Guard, or maybe even Flayed ones. And then for the rest of the game, the Night Scythe can just zoom around, hunting infantry, and maybe getting line of sight on things that other units might struggle to. Next up, we've got the Doom Scythe for 165 points. Typically, you can only take the 2 flyers in match play Strike Force games these days, and if I were running them, I'd take 1 or 2 of them as fast-moving gun platforms that pay a premium for their speed. I think following their fairly decent 15-point drop, they are looking a little bit more tempting as anti-tank now. Their damage output isn't really too bad, between 3 damage D3 plus 3 shots, plus a fair bit of anti-infantry fire, though I still think that they pay a bit of a premium for moving so quickly, and if the enemy does manage to engage them, they're not really all that hard to take down. In game on turn 1, I'd aim to start as far back as possible, maybe just in range of an Overlord for My Will Be Done. Ideally give it hitting on 2s, and then zoom to somewhere that's within 36 inches of the enemy, and ideally unload the anti-tank into a tank and the Tesla into some infantry. If they can stay safe cruising at 36 inches for a turn or 2, they could well cause enough problems to make themselves being worth it, or potentially if a seriously valuable target presents itself, zooming a massive 50 inches and landing right next to an exposed character or something, or a unit that you shouldn't be able to get line of sight on with anything else, and that could be worth putting it in a position where it's likely going to get killed for. At least if you did sacrifice it and zoom it into the middle of the enemy army, it could be another interesting one for Curse of the Pharaon to blow it up. The enemy might not see the auto-explodes coming. Next up we have the Monolith. Since the balance update, it does look like it's getting to the point where it is pretty interesting. It no longer costs CP if you're fielding it as an auxiliary, though full super heavy detachments are basically out in Nephilim, costing too many command points. If you are using one, then 1 or 2 in the Lord of War slot seems okay. You also got a solid 30 points cut, and also the core keyword, which on a 300 point model is quite a big deal. Wargear wise, I don't think the Flux Arcs are terrible, though I'd probably upgrade to the Death Rays for the big damage D3+3 shooting, and I feel it's one of the most valuable targets that you can aim at for the core buffs, things like My Will Be Done for +1 to hit, Silent King rerolling all hit rolls, or Cryptek buffs such as the Hypermaterial Ablator for light cover on a 2+ save, or healing from a Canoptek Cloak. Having one somewhere on the battle line can occasionally let you do movement shenanigans as well. If you had strategic reserve units, then getting them out of a dimensional breach could be a big surprise, or you could dimensional corridor other units across the board, either out of harm's way or to threaten nearby units. If it needs to fight on full profile for a turn, it can do so for 2 CP. And for a bunch of solid wounds with a 2+ save, it doesn't really seem too bad for 300 points, I think. I start it near characters for some decent core buffs, and likely push up towards the midfield, unleashing some anti-tank fire, and if a medium strength enemy infantry unit presents itself, it can do a fair amount of damage in combat. Strength 8 AP3 damage 3 shots are pretty nasty, particularly when there's 6 of them auto-hitting. On the other hand, the Obelisk is the other 300 point super heavy Lord of War. This thing just feels vastly inferior to the Monolith, to be honest. It's a little bit tougher, but otherwise I think it's generally inferior. It trades out a decent amount of anti-tank damage for a slightly lackluster amount of anti-infantry damage, a not particularly effective debuff against fly units, and loses its combat ability. Just as a massive unit, it's still not a terrible choice for buffing with My Will Be Done. You do get a fair amount of Tesla shots out of it, and I suppose it could be okay with the dynasties that give you OBSEC, as it is fairly tough. I'd probably be wanting to move it towards the midfield so the opponent actually has to deal with the durability, and it doesn't just get ignored. But still though, I think it's the weakest of all of the different Lords of War. Next up we've got the Tesseract Vault, 100 points more than the Obelisk or the Monolith now. It gets a few extra wounds, a 4+ invul save, and a whole bunch of souped up powers of the Catan to throw a bunch of mortal wounds around. At full profile it can usually use 3 of them per turn. I'd probably go with the longer ranged ones, Antimatter Meteor, Sky of Falling Stars, and Transdimensional Thunderbolt. I feel like it is generally the sort of thing that you don't want to be fielding alongside Catan though, as otherwise they'll be fighting for the best powers. Otherwise, like the Obelisk, it does have those Tesla orbs, so it can be okay for My Will Be Done, and Technomancer healing's quite nice on a unit with a profile of 2+ and 4+ invuls. You could also swap out one of your Catan powers for Strange Echoes as well. That one deals 3 mortal wounds on this thing, and with a pretty enormous unit profile, you could have it affecting quite a lot of units in the opponent's army if you get lucky. I'd aim to deploy this thing fairly centrally, move up and hoover up some elite infantry units with mortal wounds if you can. Ideally you don't really want to be actually dying in the centre of your own army though, as it's got rather a big explosion that goes off on a 4+, and that could be pretty game changing if it tears chunks out of all your nearby units. I would also bear in mind the massive footprint of this thing. It is going to have some issues with terrain even with fly. Really though, at the moment in the Necron Lord of War section, the Silent King is pretty much the hands down winner, a single unique character. I think we're going to be seeing him crop up rather a lot in strong Necron tournament lists. He's a unique character, so you're only getting one and he doesn't have any Wargear options. He's quite nice as the Warlord though, as he does give you command points and a useful trait. He's pretty awesome in that he's a really good support piece and a damage dealer. Ideally, I think you'd want to be working with some really big core units and giving them full rerolls to hit when shooting and full rerolls to wound in melee. Basically any of the elite Necron melee threats will really like the full rerolls to wound, anything from Wraiths to Scorpec Destroyers to Lichguard. As support from himself, perhaps a slightly infamous combo that's come out of the balanced data slate is that now he can have those Triarchal Menhirs resurrected at the moment. You would need a Technomancer from the Zarakan dynasty or a Luminor Ceres to do so, but when you're restoring 5 wounds worth of toughness 7 4+ invul might along with a massive damage 6 shooting attack, you're almost never going to get better value than that. You could also combine that with healing him as well with a Canoptek Cloak or giving him cover with the Hypermaterial Ablator. I think theoretically as well you could also even Veil of Darkness him across the board, which is pretty ludicrously threatening with just how dangerous he is. In terms of a battle plan, I'd usually want to start him behind cover that you could jump over with a move with Fly. He moves 8 inches, so that's usually going to be doable, and ideally he'd want to be pressing to somewhere that the opponent's actually going to be fighting for, likely one of the objectives in the midfield. I'd advance alongside some other big core units to buff, use his command phase buffs to give +1 to hit, re-rolling hits and re-rolling wounds to various units, and then those units can move away from him if they need to. Say he could give the re-roll to wounds for some wraiths before they go zooming out into the front of the army and charge the enemy. For his own shooting, he can put out a fair bit of anti-infantry fire, and the Minears can attempt to blast away some tanks. Command re-rolling wound rolls on the Minears doesn't seem like a bad idea if you want more damage as well. And then in melee, if he's about to get engaged in combat himself, it's quite likely he'd want to use his Fail of the Blades ability on himself, as 4 re-rolls with all of those very nice profiles is pretty massive. His obeisance generators give you a pretty powerful version of a Fight's Last rule as well. If he charges something, the enemy won't be interrupting, and it can be quite helpful if he is charging alongside other Necron units as well, and they're both hitting the same targets. It's also quite a nice one for allowing him to kind of defend other nearby Necron units, as he could heroically intervene and then combine that with a Fight's Last. Overall, he's really solid. If he is looking on his last legs though, you probably again don't really want him to die in the middle of your army. That katana will get out and cause a bunch of mortal wounds all over the place. On a 4+, that could be quite nice as well, happening in the middle of the enemy army, if you do know that he's about to go down in a blaze of glory. Overall, a pretty scary guy, between 400 points and suddenly getting core. Next up, we've got the Convergence of Dominion, the Necron Fortification, where we go from one of the best units in the Codex to one of the worst. I'd certainly not take more than one set of these. Their rules really are quite bad, unfortunately. All they really do is a close-range shooting attack, grant out a bit of extra leadership, and they used to give command protocols to those nearby, but even that has been basically taken away by the fact that everyone gets them wherever they are. In theory, you can teleport them around the board with a cryptech, though most of the time I think they're going to have something better to do. I guess when you're setting them up, you'd ideally want to park them near objectives that you know your own troops are going to hang out for the leadership boost, and where enemies might actually come in range of your shooting attack. In general though, I wouldn't count on these doing a lot besides sitting around looking rather pretty on the board. Finally, let's get into the HQ section, and I thought we'd start out with a summary of all the various flavours of Overlord. For all your My Will Be Done and Relentless March needs, we've got the standard one, the opportunity to upgrade to the Catacomb Command Barge, and then 4 different special character datasheets. They're perhaps one of the Necron characters you could justify taking 2 of. My Will Be Done for +1 to hit is usually going to be pretty handy, particularly as just about every single unit in the Necron Codex has core these days. I think you could justify 2, but usually the second one's going to be somewhat diminishing returns as you've already buffed the best targets. Wargear wise, I think my favourite choices for the main weapon would either be a War Scythe or the Staff of Light. The War Scythe is quite a nice general all-round melee choice, and the Staff of Light is a little bit weaker, but does have a small shooting attack, so you can chip in even while you're commanding forces behind the lines. A pretty popular upgrade for the Staff of Light is the Relic Voltaic Staff as well, which turns him into an okay shooting threat for a character. Then you've got the option to pick up a Resurrection Orb for 25 or 30 points. This just really depends on what else you have in the army. If you are building around big squads of Flayed Ones, Warriors, or Immortals or Lichguard or something, then usually I think you will have the opportunity to resurrect more than 25 points of models. If you wanted an extra good one, then you could have the Orb of Eternity as well, if you can spare the pre-game command points. Then you've got the option for whether or not you're taking a Catacomb Command Barge or not. It's 55 points more than the Overlord's base data slate, and it's just a general all-round upgrade. Better speed, much better durability with its quantum shielding, and also a heavy weapon shooting attack with a Gauss cannon or a Tesla one. My favourite of the 2 is the Gauss cannon there for the AP and extra damage. If you're on foot, I don't think the Veil of Darkness is in a bad place on a foot Overlord. It delivers them and a dangerous unit where they need to be, so combining that with Gauss Reaper warriors and maybe having the Overlord try and charge after could be worse. Then we've got the 4 flavours of special character Overlords. Amrakir the Traveller I think might be one of the most useful personally. He's 130 points, so a bit more than the standard Overlord, but he's not dynasty locked. Has really quite a punchy melee stat line as Necrons go, and it's really quite a solid choice if you think you're buffing a single melee squad, as it gives them +1 to hit, but also gives them +1 attack as well, so his buff is absolutely excellent on things like Scorpec Destroyers or Flayed Ones or something. Trasen the Infinite is quite a cheap overlord, again not command point locked. His main advantages are saving a command point for a relic, and he's got a fun resurrection ability where he can possess minor characters if he wants to. And then we've got two that are Sotek locked. Imitek the Stormlord I think is by far the stronger of the two. For 130 points he's just all around strong really, decent melee, a decent amount of range shooting, a once per game ability to call down a whole bunch of mortal wounds, and if he's your warlord he also grants you 2 extra command points, extra useful in Nephilim. His biggest disadvantage is coming with the Sotek dynasty. Finally, Nemesaur Zandrek doesn't give quite as much of a melee threat, but he does help out with messing with enemy command points, and has his Transient Madness buff, which allows him to give a random buff to a nearby unit. To be honest, I don't really think he's anywhere near as good as Anrakir or Imitek though. Overall, out of most of these that aren't Sotek Dynasty, I'd take either the Foot Overlord, the Catacomb Command Barge, or Anrakir the Traveller if you were supporting a melee unit. In terms of support for these guys, generally they're going to be in the thick of the action and want to have My Will Be Done and Relentless March going off on the core of your army. You could consider giving them Hand of the Pharaon for 2 My Will Be Dones if it makes sense, though pre-game command points are a bit painful to spend these days. When they die, you could think about getting them back up with resurrection protocols, and if the Catacomb Command Barge gets targeted, again Quantum Deflection is usually good for a CP. In game they want to be fairly central in the force, screened from enemy attacks, and then when the going gets tough and the Necron battle lines engage with the enemy, hopefully charging in to lend a hand, or providing a bit of a countercharge threat against enemies getting too close. Next up, advising the rulers of the dynasty, we have the Cryptex. Again, rather a lot of flavours to choose from here. Technomancers, Chronomancers, Plasmancers, and Psychomancers out of the generic set, and then 2 special characters in Illuminor Zeraz and Oricon the Diviner. I think for most of the types of Cryptex, I'd typically field one of them. I think for Technomancers, with their resurrections, you can justify more, and maybe 2 Chronomancers as well if there's multiple different things for them to support. First up, going through them, we have the Technomancers. They cost between 70 to 80 points, and I think they're perhaps the strongest Cryptek right now. They basically automatically reanimate 1 model per turn. They were previously hampered by not having many core targets to use it on, but now almost every unit in the Codex is core. They can be setting up things like Slain Canoptic Spiders, Locust Heavy Destroyers, Wraiths, Scorpec Destroyers, or multiple Warriors as you get D3 of them. If they can manage to do that 2 or 3 times over the course of a game, they might well have just justified their existence then and there. And also resurrecting things from the dead can be pretty powerful for movement shenanigans as well. Set them up towards the front of the unit and make their charge distance shorter, that's really handy for the Wraiths or the Scorpex. Typically, I think that the more valuable choice of his Wargear is the Canoptic Cloak for 10-inch movement, fly, and regenerating wounds on a damaged model. I guess if his main role was supporting something like Wraiths or Canoptic Spiders though, then the +1 to hit might have more value. Otherwise, for the generic Cryptex, I'd say the Chronomancer might be the other really strong one. He's 85 points with an Entropic Lance, he grants 1 unit of 5+ Imball save and reroll charges. I'd say perhaps this one's strongest with either big blocks of Warriors where the Imball save really makes a difference, Flayed Ones where they like both bits, and again Scorpec Destroyers can make very good use of both. Just by adding all that durability and a bit more charge threat, I think he justifies himself. Plus he can snipe away each turn with really quite a powerful anti-tank shot at Strength 8, AP 3 and a big damage D3 +3. The Plasmancer and the Psychomancer, I think despite having really quite fun models, are a bit behind the other two. The Plasmancer's damage dealer with a bunch of Strength 7 AP2 shots and a few mortal wounds each turn. At least he should be able to inflict the damage while being screened, but I think generally if you're investing in damage dealers, a lot of other choices in the Codex are going to be better than him. Certainly I don't feel that you're getting as much value from him as the buffing Cryptex. For the Psychomancer, I think he has really quite interesting rules, but are just a bit unreliable. 65 points for a leadership debuff, and a chance to remove things like objective secured, which is powerful, but just not quite reliable enough to actually buy in a whole character, I think. If you could do it automatically, then I think it'd be quite popular, but you have to roll 3d6 against leadership, and against certain armies that have decent leadership, that's going to fail a decent proportion of the time. Otherwise though, and far more positively, I really do like Illuminor Zeraz. He's 145 points, so massively more expensive, but he does bring a whole bunch of really fun things to the table. He's quite big and tanky and has got more melee threat than most of the rest of them put together. He gets to reanimate models from 2 different units at once, potentially doubling up on the healing if you've got multiple units nearby. And I believe he will be one of the ones that can resurrect Mr. Zarek's Manir as well. On top of that, he's got his augmentation rule that allows him to soup up 1 core unit per turn. It's definitely a bit random depending on which buff you get and whether or not it's useful, but it makes it rather interesting on vehicles now. The idea of Mr. Zarek getting an extra pip of strength or toughness is pretty mad, and rolling the ballistic skill or toughness for a monolith could make it very intimidating indeed. It's pretty solid to roll for on just about everything though, particularly if they happen to be a mixed range and melee threat unit. Finally, we've got Orican the Diviner, 100 points for a Chronomancer, who basically doesn't do a fat lot different to the standard one, but he's a little bit tougher and he's got a chance to go into rage mode later in the game. When the stars eventually choose to align for him, he gets a fairly decent melee profile. Overall, out of the various flavours of Cryptech, the Technomancer, Chronomancer and Illuminor Zeraz are my favourite at the moment. Otherwise, in terms of upgrades for the more generic ones, I think Chronomancers and Technomancers are often fairly good choices for the Veil of Darkness, porting themselves and a threatening unit across the board, and they do have access to all their Cryptech Arcana as well. The Hypermaterial Ablator's good on most core units, making them tougher. The Failsafe Overcharger I think is fairly potent if you're buffing Canoptex, like say Spiders, Scarabs or Wraiths, and if you just want some insurance against the Cryptech themselves getting killed, then the Photonic Transsubjector makes a single pip of damage 0 each turn, and then there's an Obfuscator one that prevents enemies shooting at them if they're greater than 12 inches away unless the Cryptech's closest. Theoretically, that could be quite a nice one if you just want them to stand on backfield objectives and the opponent not to be able to do anything about them. In general, they're going to be supporting various units as we've already discussed. I guess you could also get Crypto Thralls from them, though I feel it puts them in a bit of an awkward mixed role, as usually they just want to be avoiding combat altogether, and the Crypto Thralls sort of make them want to go towards it. Not too bad though, as an extra couple of units that can make sure that they're using Lookout Sir all the time. Otherwise, as with the rest of Necron characters, 1 command point for resurrection protocols when they die is pretty useful. In general, for the vast majority of these, in-game they just want to be loitering behind the various squads that they're buffing, avoiding combat like the plague, and perhaps chipping away with any range damage that they happen to have. Next up we've got the Standard Lord and Vargard Oberon, the Sotek Dynasty Special Character Lord. I probably wouldn't take multiples of these. They're kind of a cut price overlord and can be the cheapest way to get a resurrection orb in the army if you want one. Wargear wise, for the generic one, I'd go for a War Scythe or Staff of Light. Depends on whether you want better melee or a little bit of shooting added in. The resurrection orb can be one of the main reasons to get them if you've got decent datasheets that really want one. And if you are playing Sotek, then Vargard Oberon is a lord that costs 25 points more, decently fighting, has an ability to fight on death, and he's also got a couple of bodyguard rules for Nemesaur Zandrek. Typically though, I think I'd generally go for the standard lord profile. In game they grant 1 core unit reroll hits of 1. It's going to be more useful on the bigger and more threatening units. I guess in theory you could put this on monoliths, or Zarakan lords could put it on the Silent King himself, which will be likely quite a good return on investment. And again, like the other characters, trying to get them up when they die isn't the worst. As minor characters, again they generally want to be screened behind your advancing squads, handing out their buffs and relentless march, maybe working in tag team with an overlord with My Will Be Done, piling +1 to hit, and the lords reroll 1s as well to amp up 1 unit further. They're not really all that standout in terms of damage. They're a small countercharge threat that could kill an infantry or 2, or the Staff of Light might be able to kill an infantry model or 2 while the rest of the squad's going about its thing. Next up we've got the Royal Warden, again a support choice I wouldn't really take more than 1 of. I'd see him as a fairly expensive sort of insurance model that means that if you've got a lot of points invested in a really expensive shooting unit, then that shooting unit's not just going to get tagged in combat. Maybe some of the vehicles might be a good target for this guy, or maybe Necron warriors with Gauss Reapers that want to get in close but don't want to remain in combat ideally, or perhaps even Tomb Blades if he can manage to keep up with part of the squad. He doesn't have any Wargear choices, he has his damage to Relic Gauss Blaster. He could bear Warlord traits and relics, but I think typically they're going to be better placed on other characters. In general, much like the Lord and Overlord, he's typically going to want to be advancing around behind the rest of the forces, plinking away a few shots with the Relic Gauss Blaster, maybe frying a Space Marine or 2, and basically meaning that your nearby unit doesn't have to worry too much about being charged and having its shooting ruined. If it's left on his own, I suppose it could be an annoying single model to hide on an objective or something. Finally, for the HQ section, we get onto the Destroyer Lords. We've got the options of the Scorpec Lord or the Locust Lord. They both grant reroll wound rolls of 1 auras for destroyers, and I think in most armies I'd not want to take more than one of these. The buff just feels a little bit less flexible than my will be done, only affecting certain sectors of your army. I feel like the two datasheets are at least fairly well balanced. The Scorpec Lord is more expensive at 130 points, but has better melee threat at strength 8, AP 4, and a big damage of 3. He is pretty much the fightiest of the generic base Necron characters. Otherwise, the Locust Lord is 100 points base, a decent bit cheaper than the Scorpec one, and still packs a War Scythe or something. He's got the option to take a Phylactery for a D3 wounds healing with his living metal, which I think is a reasonable upgrade. And if you want a Resurrection Orb, then he's another place that you can buy one in, if it makes sense for the units that you're fielding. Most of the time though, if he is running with destroyers, I don't think destroyers tend to be the best target for that. Generally, you'd want to pair these guys with destroyers, probably the melee versions like the Scorpex more so than the ranged I think, as they typically want to be using their good combat profiles. Maybe you could have them shadowed by Locust destroyers in the first turn or two before they go off and do combat things with the Scorpex. They perhaps could be an interesting choice for using that reroll charge rolls trait as well, as that would help out the Scorpec destroyers nearby. So with the Destroyer Lords done, that just about brings us to the end of our Codex Necrons unit review. A whole lot of interesting stuff there, and made far more interesting by a bunch of helpful points cuts. The core keyword for the majority of the army now are much better command protocols. Between all that and secondary objectives, it is looking like Necrons are looking far stronger than they were. I'll certainly be looking to make a few more videos on them in the future, maybe exploring a few combos or any successful lists that people make with them. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see any of that. I'm sure we'll have plenty of Necron videos into the future. And finally, if you have found this video useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Making great big whole codex review videos like this does take an awful lot of time and effort, so if you have found it useful for your Necrons, any support is massively appreciated if you felt like it. The Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making videos like this as my main thing. I do try and give a few rewards to people who support the channel, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll certainly hope to see you guys next time.